Welcome to VidDevoChurch. This is our version of high noon, so to speak. We want to take our time to maybe get together and examine those scriptures and begin to look at life as we live it here in Utah. Maybe quantifying or qualifying our normal way of living to add something to it to make our life a little more enjoyable, a little more able to get along, maybe with people that we don't sing the same song with. I know that, if I had a voice, I'd join the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, but they're not going to send me an invitation to come sing with them. Just like the Catholic Church, I'm sure that they have a marvelous Latin Mass, but given that my skill in Latin isn't quite up to snuff, I don't see myself singing like the Vienna Boys Choir. Having said those things, I don't find myself really going to the Baptist church in order to find out what kind of orchestration they may have on Sunday. But at high noon, we want to take the time, kind of like an old Cary Grant movie, to have a shootout. To face the music, to stare down the issue, to look at things that maybe aren't quite up to snuff, that need a look at and maybe an examination to have one point of view looked at that maybe others can't say anything about. For instance, here in Utah, we've been talking a lot about recently the excommunication of certain people that are a part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For those that don't know that, that's the Mormon Church. Now, you can't call all Mormons the same because even inside of the original Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there are different kinds of Mormons inside it. Some that don't study at all the Mormon doctrine and religions and things that go on inside the church. Some that are a part in the closet, so to speak, hiding out inside the church because it's got some good education or some good programs for children. There are some that maybe they agree with everything that's being said in the church. There are some that disagree and can't say anything about it. But the Mormon Church isn't the only church that does things like that. They are certainly one of those more strict religions that in this state has exercised their authority to do what we call excommunicate. And because they did, we want to question that and to say, well, as a Mormon, I could see, Mormons excommunicating Mormons. But if I was a Mormon, the question I would have is, where is the love? Because if I'm claiming that I'm the Church of Jesus Christ, even though it may add to it of Latter-day Saints, the question of being a Church of Jesus Christ is, where is the love? Now, when I ask that question of a Mormon, I don't ask them only. I ask myself also, where is my love? Do I love the Mormon as much as I love the Mormon who's been excommunicated? Do I love that person who has been thrown out of fellowship in the church? Do I love the Catholics that have been excommunicated and become Lutherans or Protestants? Do I agree that there's a certain time and a place for discipline in the church? Or is there something that's going beyond that measure of setting aside a person for incommunicado, so to speak, that they may repent and change their ways and come back into the church one day? So the question I have is, in Utah, those that have been excommunicated, do they feel as though they were loved and it was done in love to them, for them, and about them? That's really where you and I would have to ask ourselves, how would you feel if Jesus Christ excommunicated you? Now, what we want to do is we want to kind of examine someone who was proclaiming Jesus and talk a little bit about that too. There was a man that was sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness. His lifestyle, his way of living, the things that he did and the things that he said demonstrated that he was a witness to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of the light that was to come. That was the true light which lights every man that comes into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. And he came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. Now, that's interesting to me because it says that he was that light. In other words, if I want to know and I want to take a spotlight and look at something, I can look at it through the lens of Jesus Christ. He came into the world and his own received him not. Did those who didn't receive him excommunicate him? In fact, that's what happened to Jesus. Jesus was excommunicated by the lawyers of his day. Jesus was excommunicated by the righteous leaders of his time. Jesus was excommunicated as a heretic following a false religion and claiming to be God himself. Now, if we wanted to put Joseph Smith standards of being a prophet of God next to Jesus Christ's claims of being the Son of God, we would have to say, Joseph Smith doesn't hold a candle to what Jesus claimed. Jesus claimed that he was one with his Father, and he was held accountable for that and excommunicated. They leveled the sin of blasphemy against him and crucified him for it. Now, it's interesting that the Church of Jesus Christ is called that because it's of Jesus Christ. Now, we could say that, if we get excommunicated, we're probably of that same church that Jesus was in some ways, because we've done something that maybe it's patterned like Jesus. Maybe a lot like Jesus, we find ourselves doing things that will get us excommunicated. I know for myself, I don't agree with a lot of principles, a lot of doctrines or dogmas and disciplines that go on inside the church, but I respect the church being able to make that claim to have its own authority. In other words, if the Catholic Church decided to excommunicate a Catholic, I'd say, you can. That's your right as a Catholic church. Those that have the power of excommunication and those that are part of that church agree together that if you don't do what the church tells you to do, you can be excommunicated. But my question for a Catholic would be, if you're a Catholic and you get excommunicated, are you in fact not just like Joan of Arc or some of the others that were following God that were killed in the name of quote-unquote excommunication? We're not the very Inquisition time period with which the church began to kill those who didn't follow its precepts and predicates of faith. Were they not excommunicating Catholics and people that they saw as threats to their own religious system? So my question would be, when someone excommunicates, are they acting out what God has said, or are they acting out what religion has said? You see, the point that I see in Paul's writing to the Gentile church, which is what, no offense to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they would be considered a Gentile church. You see, there's a difference between a Jew and a Gentile. You see, a Jew is a Jew. That's just the way it is. God says, hey, you're a Jew, and he basically picks and chooses who's a Jew. A Jew is someone that God said when he chose Abraham and said, look, I'm going to take you away from your people. I'm going to take you away from your nation. I'm going to take you away from every other situation you're involved in, and I'm going to make a people out of you. I would dare to say Abraham was excommunicated from his nation, excommunicated from his religion that was from Chaldea and Chaldees in Ur of the Mesopotamian area, an environment where they were, to put it bluntly, killing children and sacrificing to the moon goddess, to, worshiping, even like today, you get evangelicals worshiping the red moon, talk about moonies. Whoa, you think you're the first ones to come along with the red moon? I think they were doing that back in Ur of the Chaldees, and God said, no, no, no. But that being another topic, right now we're talking about Abraham was not a Jew till the day God said, I will make you a people. He didn't call them Jews. That's from the term Judah, which is from the tribe of Judah, because as the assimilation and as God began to judge the children of Israel, then of those tribal affiliations, most people just simply labeled all Jews because of the largest tribe, Judah, that was still in existence at the time that Gentiles began to get involved with Jewish culture. When you look at the book of Acts, you can see that there were people from Asher, there were people from Naphtali, there were people from different tribes of the children of Israel. And when people tell me today that the tribes are lost, I like to say to them, who lost them? The Gentiles? Because the Jews didn't lose them. The Jewish people still know who's what and where and why and how and what. So even as there's a criteria that Ezra began when it came about to building the temple, so too when the children of Israel go back to Israel as a nation, there's a criteria they have to live by or be examined by in order to be considered a Jew with the right of return to move or to immigrate into Israel. Now, you can do it as a non-Jew, and, God will allow you to if the fact of the matter that the state of Israel says, okay, we don't have enough non-Jewish people, we'll let a few of you come in, unless Bibi gets his way and stops that from happening. But Mr. Netanyahu tried to stop non-Jews from becoming Israeli citizens, and his government fell apart. Well, that's what the recent elections were about. Bibi felt as though, Mr. Netanyahu, as though the nation, because of settlers and people inside the nation of Israel, and the fact that the non-Jew was having more children than the Jew, they felt like, well, we need to make sure this stays a Jewish nation. So they wanted to pass an edict that Israel is a Jewish nation. Well, it's not. It is a nation of Jews. There's a difference. The charter never said it was a Jewish nation. It said that those that were living in the land would be Israeli citizens. That's why it's a Zionist nation, certainly, but it's not a Jewish nation like Mr. Netanyahu wants to change the charter of Israel to state it's a Jewish nation, just in case, like we know in Southern California, a lot of Latinos have moved into the state, and now Orange County has 51% Latino. And so there's a differential between what used to be what they called white OC and now non-white OC. Well, frankly, I don't get much on the white and non-white, but okay, fine. If, everybody's going to exercise lordship over one another, they can act like Gentiles. But there was a difference that God had said between a Gentile and a Jew. And to the end of the world, there will be. Because there's going to be 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe of the children of Israel. And there will be from each tribal designation. And they will go out and witness to the world. But having said all that, the Church of Jesus Christ doesn't recognize those distinctions. Because Paul said there's neither Jew nor Gentile, barbarian, Scythian, nor free. So according to what Jesus said, then he would bear witness of the light, and it were born not of the blood, nor the will of man, but of God. So if you were born of God, you were in the Church of Jesus Christ that he was setting up according to John the Baptist. And so I find it interesting that what are you getting excommunicated from if Abraham, the father of Jewish culture, was excommunicated from his faith in Ur of the Chaldees, and he's the first Jew, so to speak, and then he's also the father of faith according to the Christian theology. And I don't know what the Mormons think of Abraham, but dare I say, they think that he's not as great as what, a Christian does. So I question what Mormon theology is doing and trying to change, but that's okay, they're Mormons. But My point is this, is if the Bible says that God has done it, meaning the will of God, and it's God's will that God creates a certain amount of people that are His, and He calls them by name, then it may not be about Jewish, and it may not be about Christian, but it may be about born of God. And so, can you be excommunicated by God Almighty? If God says no, does man say yes? See, there's where I find it interesting, is that God took Abraham out of where he was at to be better. Now, I don't know where you're at in the Catholic Church. I don't know where you're at in the Protestant Church. I don't know where you're at in certain churches that still practice this idea of law and the prophets and don't extend grace to you. They don't extend the mercy of God for you. They demonstrate by their actions less of that nature with which we are told you would know you are my disciples in that you have love for one another. If you aren't loving, then are you a disciple of Jesus? You see, that's where I find it interesting about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I find it interesting about the Roman Catholic Church, about the Greek Orthodox Church, about the Byzantine Church, about the Protestant Church, the Lutheran Synod, about any of these churches, because the question I have is, where is the love? So, I can go with you if you said that you wanted to put someone incommunicado of the organized religious system where you were saying, we don't want to talk to you for a while until you get it together. I could stand for that. You know, in some ways, tough love says you have to separate yourself for a season. But even Paul wrote about, hey, you know, don't condemn the person. I mean, welcome the person back. You know, remember, the church in those days was the provision of health, wealth, happiness. They gave out clothes. They provided for food. They were the health department. They were literally sharing the wealth department. They were part of the community. And that's what is so devastating for some today that have lived under that religious system called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They have existed a lot of times from more than one generation, much like Judaism has done and some other religions have done in the world, that when you have been more than one generation inside of a religious system, you can't imagine being outside of the religious system. You think of the religious system as being your government. You think of the religious system as being your ethnos or your ethical balance. You think of it as being your religious system being your faith in God. Everything is tied to that religious system. But being excommunicated from that religious system, that's like a death. It's like a dying to the flesh, but maybe to live to the spirit. You see, I see excommunication as a positive thing. I think it's wonderful if you get excommunicated from the Catholic Church. I think it would be a blessing if you got excommunicated from the Lutheran Church. I think it would be powerful witness and testimony to get excommunicated from the Mormon Church. I think that it's marvelous that God took Abraham and excommunicated him from the pagan system that he was a part of. In other words, what you're doing with this excommunication determines where you are with God. You see, excommunicated from a religious system isn't a bad thing if you're heading towards a good thing, meaning you're incommunicado or in communication with God. Incommunicado means not in communication with. But if you are becoming communicado or becoming communicative, you are beginning to, as we know John just said, which were born not of the blood. So dare I say, if you're a Mormon and you've been, welcomed into that temple kind of thingy, well, hey, nor the will of the flesh. Yeah, well, that's flesh, because after all, it's being done by man. But if you're born of the will of God, then God is the one who determines for you what you are, not what man does. You see, that's what happened a lot in the Jesus movement when, frankly, the church couldn't deal with the fact that God had not spoken to the church. Over 100 years ago, in the 1800s, God had miraculously, powerfully moved in the church. He had done what they used to call Azusa Street revivals, and then around the world at different countries. I think it was over in Ireland and also in maybe China, I think, and a bunch of different countries all around the world. There was this great, powerful outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And with that time period, there was a great revival of looking for and understanding that God was doing something. Well, God did something. God started the children of Israel returning to the land in the 1800s. As a matter of fact, that's when the time clock of latter days began. The latter days started not at the beginning of Acts, as some people want to say, but the latter days started when in the World Zionist Congress, Theodore Herzl stood up and said, today we have a nation. Now we must go make it a reality. And so 120 years after Theodore Herzl declared that he had a nation, Jerusalem was declared the capital of Israel forever. 120 years. Interesting statement of that 120. That's the number of man. It's the number of years that man was determined that he should live. And so the beginning of the latter days was 120 years before the actual capital of Jerusalem. Some people like to say that that's when the timetable of the end times begins, was when Jerusalem became the capital unified of the nation Israel. And I would tend to agree. That would be the end times beginning. Now, the latter days of the end times began with Theodore Herzl's declaration that, we are a nation. And then roughly 100 years, 67, 48. So, so many years earlier, we would say 40 years approximate, but approximately 40 years earlier than 1967, the nation, by the will of man, became a nation, and everything that Theodore Herzl said, whether it be the flag or the song or how the government was organized or the national language, all was done according to what Theodore Herzl said. Although we give credit to someone else nowadays, as the father of Israel, he wasn't the first one that started it all. Dare I say, Theodore Herzl was. So, when we look at things, we need to examine the roots of it and say, well, are we in fact the Church of Jesus Christ, or are we the Church of Jesus Christ of a religious system? See, the Church of Catholics, the Church of Mormons, the Church of Protestants, the Church of Baptists, the Church of Evangelicals, they all act like and state that they can excommunicate you. And I would question whether they are excommunicating you or they aren't blessing you in disguise. You see, I don't care if you're an evangelical or you're a Protestant or you're a Methodist or you're an atheist or you're a Episcopalian or you're a Mormon or you're a Jack Mormon or a hidden Mormon or a closet Mormon or whatever Mormon you are or whatever Christian you are or whatever atheist you are or whatever any person you are. Whether or not you are of God is determined by God, not by man. Even as we're looking at, if you want to read it for yourself, go look at John chapter 1, verses 6 through 13. Which were born not of blood. So, hey, being Jewish by blood doesn't do you any good. I mean, as far as God's concerned, being of the will of the flesh doesn't do you any good because that's what the Mormon church did, and the Catholic church, and the Protestant church, and the Jewish church, and the Messianic church, and the Evangelical church. Of the will of the flesh, they started religion. They started their own churches. The church of, and they have a name for it, whatever it may be. Whether it be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the Church of the Roman Catholic, church, or the Church of St. Francis or St. Bartholomew or St. whatever, or the Church of the Evangelical or the Church of Calvary Chapel. They are of the will of man and the will of the flesh, but are they of God? You see, that's why the criteria has always come back to that one thing Jesus said, by this. And I wish he'd have said this alone, but he didn't. He said, by this shall they know that you are my disciples indeed. In that you have love for one another. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never heard of an excommunicated Mormon telling me that they felt love by being excommunicated. I've never heard of a Catholic telling me they felt love when they were excommunicated. I don't know of anybody thrown out of a church or told not to come back that said, oh, thank you for loving me. It was a blessing in disguise. But Abraham, being pulled out of Ur of the Chaldees, as he went out, And as God finally tests him in the long run, when he finally had his son, God looks at Abraham and says, now I know that you love me more than you love your son. And that's where we know that Abraham is born not of the will of the flesh, not of the will of man, and not of blood, but of the will of God. He has loved his God with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength, and been tested and proved to be true. And at that moment, I am sure God, blessing him and speaking to him, Abraham said, I am loved. Thank you for excommunicating me from Ur of the Chaldees, where I would have killed my only begotten son. Because that's where he came from. His nature was to kill his son. But God spared Isaac as a demonstration of what was to come in the future. That God would spare you that ignominy or that ignominious realization that mankind, when they set up religions, are going to do things to you that are not right, that are not true, that are not part of being a Christian. Excommunication is one of them. It is never meant to be used against people to teach them about obeying the law. It was never meant to be said that you have to do this or be left outside of the provision of the church. As a matter of fact, one of the expressions that we have is we have been given grace for grace. And that's what we wanted to read as we're closing now in wrapping this up as a high noon Sunday afternoon, looking at and shooting from the hip, kind of speaking the truth in love. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And John bore witness of him, crying, saying, this is he of whom I spoke. He that comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness have we received grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. Now I like the Pope. The Pope's a nice guy. He reminds me of the Dalai Lama. He reminds me of the Council of 12. You know, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has their own little Sanhedrin, their own little council, their own little prophet, that says, hey, I've been talking to God and God's been talking to me and I got something to tell you, church. And so they get this, kind of meeting together and they decide if that's what God has said, and then they validate it, They have their own self-awareness and self-discipline. And, they did that to Joseph Smith. They sat down and said, hey, you are telling us that you saw this and, you believe this and this is what it is. And they decided that at that time, their own grouping, that they would believe in it. And so they run around declaring, I believe that Joseph Smith was the prophet of God. And they declare that. Well, the declaration of John the Baptist is greater than that of those which are in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The declaration of John the Baptist is greater than the declaration of the Roman Catholic Church. The reason being is both of them claim to be the Church of Jesus Christ. And that church was founded upon John the Baptist as he was before the church, as he bore witness of the truth, as he was that light that was not Jesus, as he said, it's not me, but there was one that came who was going to bear witness of God. And there was only one person who could do that could tell the truth about God. And that one person would come, would teach us about God, for he was before all people, and he was with God in the beginning. That is the Son of God, the only begotten Son of God. And if Jesus came with grace and truth, then we here at High Noon have to examine this excommunication idea and say it's false. What kind of grace is given when you excommunicate someone? What kind of grace is the love that's not demonstrated being made manifest to these people who are and were doing what they felt like was true at the time? Are you, in fact, disciplining a person that God has loved and God is using, as opposed to maybe examining yourself and finding the person who's excommunicated is you? Because if you made a decision to remove yourself from someone else that's born, created, and exists in the image of God, God might be speaking through them to you. And the question would be, are you demonstrating you're a disciple of Jesus, since he is the only one who is full of grace and truth, by demonstrating you're his disciple in that you have love for one another? You can't tell me you love your brother and excommunicate. You can't tell me you love your brother and shoot him. You can't tell me you love your brother and kill him. You could be, like we said, incommunicado, maybe setting them aside and not communicating with them for a while and say, hey, you need to take 3 days, and have some peace and quiet, and get your act together, because, you're kind of like breaking the law here. The law says we got to do this. And the law came by Moses. But it doesn't say that the law came by or was given by God. It says the law was given by Moses. But even though the law says you can excommunicate, grace and truth comes by Jesus Christ. You see, that's the point of high noon. That sheriff that decides to have it out with the outlaw, the person who's, quote unquote, out there, is going to, try to prove his point. He's going to fire as fast as he can. He's going to pull that gun and he's going to pull the trigger and he's going to shoot at Gary Cooper at high noon. And guess who's going to win? If you've ever seen the movie, you know. Because the law is being put in examination at high noon. There is a shootout going to happen. And here at VidDevoChurch, we've had our high noon, and we have decided that you cannot express the Church of Jesus Christ in excommunication. You cannot demonstrate the love of God through excommunication in any way, shape, or form and have that as validated in grace and mercy, or have that as provable that you are demonstrating grace for grace. As a matter of fact, we have proven in our study today that God has excommunicated people by taking them out of whatever religious system that was made by the will of man and put them into the will of God by excommunicating them from what men were doing so that they could do what God is doing. That's the difference between what religious systems do and what God does. So we have determined that anyone, anywhere, at any time that's ever been excommunicated for any reason is welcome here at VidDevoChurch. We will always open our doors to anyone, everyone, any place, anytime to demonstrate the love of God to the entire world, because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Our law of God is manifested in the mercy and grace and truth of Jesus Christ, demonstrating what the law of God was meant to do. And that is to cause us to be more merciful, to cause us to give more grace, to cause us to be more compassionate, to cause us to open our doors to those that need to be loved, that need to be cared for, that need to find at high noon they still have a place of shade. They can still find rest and don't have to be put to the test in firing their guns off at God and saying, where were you? When in reality, these excommunication ideas aren't by the will of God, aren't by the Son of God, aren't by the faith of God, but are done of the flesh by the will of man and are not what God intended for man to do. Because you see, what God intended for man to do was to respond to the love that God has for him. That is and always will be what the Church of Jesus Christ is always about. It's not a Latter-day Saint. It's not the Roman Catholic. It's not the Protestant. It's not the Methodist. It's not the Jew. It's not the Gentile. It is born of God. And that's what we all should become.